Making this Minions video was supposed to be a real easy thing. It was supposed to be simple. It wasn't supposed to be something that was going to cause a headache or stress, but yet here we are. It all started with rewatching the movies, which I definitely enjoyed doing, but then I started getting to the nitty-gritty of it and to break down the timeline, and I almost immediately ran into trouble. Right? I got my basic timeline put together. There were some questions I had, and so I went looking for other places online that people were talking about this. And luckily, I found that there is a wiki specifically talking about the timeline of the Minions movies. But that timeline is a dumpster fire. It blatantly is saying things happened in years where they definitely didn't happen, not because of any guesses that we have to make, but because the movie just says, this happened in this year.
The year was 1985, and the #1 show on TV was Evil Brat!
But in taking a look at the wiki and noticing there's no real sources there, I decided I got to go find my own sources. And in all the research I'm doing, I'm just finding more and more that the timeline of this series just does not make sense. I mean, if we look at the events of the second Minions movie, Gru says that he's 11 3/4 years old, which means that back in Minions 1, when the Minions see him for the first time, he would have only been 3 years old. You're telling me that this kid right here is only 3? It's almost like the people making this series didn't care. They don't care about the timeline. They don't care about it making sense. And at that point, that is all that I cared about. It had to make sense. I was at rock bottom here. Every time I'd see a Minion, I'd get stressed out wondering about which Minion it was and what they had done in the years before, what was happening right now. And it was at that point that I realized none of it mattered. Nobody walks into a new series and say, man, I sure love how the canon for this is lined up and how I know everything that happens in this particular order is all going to be there. When we get to that point, I think we need to take a step back and remember that we got into these stories because of how they made us feel. And I had almost lost sight of that. And luckily it wasn't too late. I was able to take a step back and realize things that fit on the timeline didn't matter more than things that didn't fit on the timeline. The most important thing was how they made me feel. And going forward, I hope I can remember that. Now, having said all of that, I still kind of want to share the timeline that I got put together with you, because I did put quite a bit of time into working on it. So here is the timeline for the Minions and Despicable Me movies. It's accurate. It's not necessarily specific in points, but here we go. We'll start off a few billion years ago. The Minions pop into existence and immediately start looking for their first boss single cell organisms at this point. They move forward in time. We get to about 65 million years ago. This is where they're going to be meeting up with the T-Rex and hanging out with him until, of course, they accidentally cause his death. Jumping forward in time to between 300,000 BC and 200,000 BC, we're going to have when the Minions were working for the caveman. Now, like I said, we're going to try to be accurate, not necessarily specific. 100,000 years of wiggle room is the most wiggle room I'm going to ask for, so please just grant me this. Around 2700 BC, we're going to have the Pharaoh, where they build that first pyramid. I'm going to put it here just because it looks like there aren't any other pyramids around. And so if this is like one of those big 3 pyramids right over there in Egypt, the other ones weren't there yet. And so we're going to put it at the earlier stage when these could have been. Sometime in the Dark Ages is when we're estimating that the vampire stuff is going to be going on. We know for sure it's going to happen between 2700 BC and 1812. We're going to get our first full year, 1812, with Napoleon. Now we're going to put it here specifically, even though Napoleon was off doing stuff a bunch of different times, because they're in the snow. And so we're going to assume that's when he is invading Russia. And so that's when we're going to put this one right here. 1812 is going to be a big year for the Minions because they're going to actually move away from Napoleon as their boss because he ends up not liking them after he almost gets blown up by them. And they end up going and living in a cave for the next while. In fact, they're living in that cave from 1912 until 1968. Conveniently, this is going to let them be able to avoid those more modern atrocities again, like I mentioned earlier in the video, that happened during World War II. So if you ever hear anybody thinking they're being smart or being funny, being like, oh, well, what were the Minions doing during World War II? You can let them know they were in an ice cave. Duh. Next up, we move up to 1964 or 1965, depending on the month. It's not exactly 100% clear. We get some mixed messages in there, but that's when Felonious Gru, and Drew Gru are born, and then later separated when their parents divorce, just like in The Parent Trap. So we finally get to 1968, and it's at this point when the Minions decide to set out and find a new boss that's been hiding in this cave for long enough. They think that it's a good time to come out and do that. It's one Minion in particular has the idea to do this. His name is Kevin, but he gets the help of Stuart and Bob, and they all go out together in search of a new boss. Eventually, they find Scarlet Overkill, who enlists them in her mission of stealing the Queen's crown so that she can become the new Queen of England. Now, during the pursuit of the crown, they actually send the world into what I would imagine would be absolute chaos by causing the English monarchy to change hands 3 times in 3 days. The first one happens when they actually do successfully steal the crown from the Queen, but in the pursuit that follows after that, where they're getting chased by the police and everything, Bob actually draws the legendary sword from the stone and becomes the new rightful King of England. But his boss shows up, Scarlet, and they give her the crown and make her the new queen, so changing hands again. And then finally, once Scarlet Overkill is defeated, once Kevin becomes ginormous and battles her in the streets of London, everything goes back to normal. And as the first Minions movie is closing out, they actually meet Gru. And so they meet Gru for the first time. Again, according to the technical timeline, this kid is supposed to be 3 years old at this point. I ain't buying that, and that's why we kind of aren't worrying about the specifics in here. In January 1976, we're going to get the events of Minions 2, Rise of Gru, or just Minions Rise of Gru. And now we know for sure that it happens in 1976 because there's a giant billboard that says 1976. It's that simple, Despicable Me Wiki. It's that simple. It's right there. And then we can actually kind of pinpoint the date of some of the events of the movie with the fact that it's happening on Chinese New Year, which that year would have been January 31st. So the very end of the movie, the big fight, happens on January 31st, 1976. A little bit later on, at an uncertain date, Dr. Nefario begins to work with Gru, creating gadgets and everything for him. And then we jump forward close to a decade to 1985, where we have the premiere of the TV show Evil Brat. It's a big TV show. This kid is playing an evil genius and everything. He does spy stuff and steals and is just a villain. And it goes really well, very popular, until eventually the show gets canceled 3 years later in 1988. Now, you might be saying, oh, if it only ran for 3 years, shouldn't this happen in 1987? And I would say, no, that's not how TV shows worked back then. Back then, what would happen is a show would start, generally, of course, there are exceptions, but generally what would happen is a TV show would start in the fall, usually in September, and then that season would run until the spring. And so if one season's going to go from 85 to 86, then we go 86 to 87, and then 87 to 88. Giving us that final date. And then that brings us up to the events of the actual main movies, Despicable Me 1, 2, and 3, which I'm just going to say happen in the early 2010s, because to get more specific than that is what drove me crazy. With that being said, that's going to be where I'm going to finish up my vague but accurate timeline of the Minions and Despicable Me movies. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this video and my little breakdown, I guess. But yeah, I had a great time looking at these movies. Really looking forward to the fourth one. And so you can expect a tier list connected to the series next week. So I'm looking forward to putting that one out here too. So thanks so much for being here. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. You take care. See you then. Bye.